Welcome to this inaugural beta edition of Dev Game Club, featuring me, Brett Duville, and my estimable co-host,
Tim Longo.
Tim, why don't you lay out this idea, the idea behind this cast?
Yeah, sure. It's something I wanted to do for a long time, and I wanted wanted a good friend to come along for the ride for me and with me, and it's heavily inspired and semi ripped off, to be honest, from another favorite podcast of mine, Rebel FM, where they used to do a game club with some journalists, and they would play play a game. And each podcast play a chunk and then talk about that chunk, and then the community and the listeners could, play along with them chunk by chunk, with, avoiding spoilers, etc. And I really love the format. And typically at the end of the, of the series, they would have a guest, ideally someone who worked on that game, come in and talk about, obviously, their experiences and give some further insights. But the idea that I feel like there really wasn't anything like it out there was to have devs actually talk about doing the same thing and talk about games, and from their own insights, obviously with the unique perspective. Journalists have their perspective, and then we would have our own. And so Brett and I both being longtime developers at this point, I guess we can say.
Certainly,
I think I thought it was a good duo to kind of walk through some games and try it out, and a little bit of an experiment. Yeah, so that was kind of the genesis of the idea. I think we have a good perspective. I think with Brett's doing his own streaming these days with Republic Commando and stuff, and doing kind of similar things. And it seems like people really enjoy hearing the nuts and bolts of things. So, yeah,
absolutely. Well, and let me know, when I have to step aside for that good friend to come in. And that'll be great.
I will. I invited him. He's on his way.
I'm sure he is. That'll be great.
So, yep.
My own history in games starts right around the time System Shock 2 came out, and we haven't talked about which game we're talking about, but there it is.
There it is.
I started it in the very beginning of 1998, which makes me a late teen in video game development years now. My three games at LucasArts were all with you: Starfighter, Jedi Starfighter, and Republic Commando. Since then,
such a terrible experience.
Such a terrible trio. And since then, I did some consulting, and I'm consulting now. But in the meantime, I had been part of three games with Bethesda Game Studios: Fallout 3, Skyrim, and Fallout 4. Why don't you brief the listeners a little bit on your own history?
Yeah, it's April will be actually 20 years for me. So I started in '96. In QA, actually. So I was, definitely starting there at the bottom of the ladder and working my way up, I guess, on your sort of the romanticized way, if you will. And first game I tested was X-Wing versus TIE Fighter. So I got to work with Larry Holland and, the X-Wing guys and TIE Fighter folks over there. And first level design job was with Mysteries of the Sith, which was expansion pack for Jedi Knight 1. Over to Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine, and then joined Brett on Starfighter and Jedi Starfighter, and then Republic Commando. Took a year off outside of games, doing some completely different things, and came back into the industry at Crystal Dynamics to work on the Tomb Raider reboot. And I was employee number 2 on that project for many years, and then did franchise direction for Tomb Raider, and went back to LucasArts, and then Disney came in, and then I went to 343 Industries to work on Halo 5, which we just shipped in the end of last year.
Yeah, congratulations on that.
Thank you, and to Fallout 4.
Yeah, good games by all accounts.
Yes. So, did you want to run through some of the sort of format or episode stuff that we've been talking about?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and then we'll jump in with sort of a history, of System Shock 2, or at least our perspective on it.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, what you envision kind of a layout of, say 3 or 4 episodes going around a particular game.
Yeah, so Brett and I were batting this back and forth, and we thought it'd be cool to definitely start off with the first episode kind of being half half sort of relevance and history and the way that we see how this game impacted us and how we think it impacted the industry, and looking backward with the hindsight, etc. And typically, I think we're going to probably try to, for a while, play older games and not really focus on recently released games for the point of the podcast. And a lot of people haven't played these games, so maybe it'd be a good opportunity for people to jump in. And then, in the middle episode, second, third, fourth, however long the game will be, that will be focused on the playing of each of the chunks of the game. But that first episode will be half that, half the history, half actually talking about the first opening of the game, and the first experiences with it. And then we're hoping, obviously, in the final episode, we'll do our own summaries and kind of takeaways and favorite moments, most hated moments, etc. Any controversy, throw in some fun stuff at the end. And then, when possible, we're definitely, we've been around for a while, so we may have contact with people who worked on the games that we're playing. So we're going to try to get guests to come in for that final episode, just like they did for Rebel FM, and get another dev perspective on it, other than our own dev perspective. So.
Yeah, I think that'll be really exciting. It's really fun to talk with people about their games, and especially for games that are a bit older. Or from companies that are no longer with us. In the case of, for example, Republic Commando, it's actually, it's really easy to talk about them. You don't really have to fear that, some legal department is going to be looking at you cross-eyed. So some of these older games are actually really good for that. But it also, they're from formative times when a lot of things hadn't yet been figured out. And you can definitely feel that playing System Shock 2. There are definitely aspects where I'm like, oh yeah, I had forgotten this was what games were more like back then. So I think that between those sorts of areas, there's a lot of interesting things to talk about, and it'd be great to get some original devs on these games talking about them. I'd love to pick their brains.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good way to end up. So we'll figure that out as we go. This is their beta, so we're going to test some stuff out, and we have some segments, along the way about kind of running through how to talk about games. But I'm sure Brett would agree we're going to be pretty flexible and casual about it, and we'll see where the topics take us.
Yeah, absolutely. So System Shock 2. Worth talking a little bit about the history of this game. I think one of the things that's really important about it is that it was the first game by Irrational Games, who have sort of gone through a bit of reformulation in the last few years. But for a number of years, maybe 15 years, we're really kind of at the forefront of these sort of immersive first-person shooters that were also sims or had simulation elements that were deeper than most shooters, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, I remember, let's see, we were working on Starfighter at the time. Did we talk about
this?
We were.
We have not.
Yeah. So we were on the same game at the same time when this came out, and I mean, it was the first shooter. I loved shooters at the time. Really big fan, probably my favorite genre, even though we were working on a flight action game. And I remember the merging of all of the different genre aspects that they had in this game, kind of being a little bit of a eye opener for me, and kind of realizing that obviously that's something that could be done and should be done, and it was. Ultima Underworld was another game that you and I debated about maybe starting off with, and obviously it's a precursor to this game for sure.
Definitely.
Some of the same people worked on them.
Yes, but, and the original System Shock was Doug Church, who I think also worked on Ultima Underworld. So there's there's definitely a through line of those people. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I just loving Ultima Underworld as a player before I got into the industry, and then System Shock 2 for me, and I remember kind of those vague memories of just having a more, I guess, a bit better usable game, usability wise, and kind of more pure. Ultima Underworld was really a Genesis project when they were still figuring stuff out. They really weren't sure what this genre was, And I just feel like, and getting back into the game now, having not played it for many years, there's a lot of it that still holds up. I've actually been pretty surprised. I was expecting it not to hold up as well as it has been for me, at least.
Right, and I think actually both this and the original probably would hold up about as well. This is certainly prettier than the original System Shock, so I think it's a little easier and more approachable just from that standpoint.
Yeah, and cleaner UI, cleaner HUD, and a little less complicated, and just the blending of things, and obviously, I'm sure we'll kind of talk a little bit about Deus Ex here and there too, being a game that would come out after this that had influences in both, and Warren Spector working on both of those, and yeah, it's been surprising to me at how well it's held up for me, at least, jumping back in. Even though there's some clunkiness here and there, of course, and it was back in the day, but I remember just that kind of shock and awe for me, and I think ever since this particular game as a first-person game, it's really influenced the way that I've always thought about design, specifically because of that that blending of all those genres.
Yeah, and absolutely, it is one of those early games as a player while I was a developer that has really made a mark, together with its sort of immediate technical predecessor, Thief, with which it shares an engine, more or less. The Dark engine, which powered Thief, also powers System Shock 2. It really, those are two games I can remember from that era more than any other that would thoroughly absorb me, and just like draw me in. I can remember being in my office when the Thief demo dropped, and playing it, and having the headphones on, and creeping around some building or something, and having Darren Stinnett, walk up behind me and put his hand on my shoulder suddenly, and and give me a shock of my own.
I think I remember that story, actually.
Yeah,
as you're saying it.
Well, that is not the scariest thing that happened with this game for me, but that was one moment definitely at LucasArts. Back then, we would actually play games sometimes during the day. We rarely have that kind of time anymore.
Yeah. I think it's to your point about like it's actually at the time I remember it being a hard game to classify, and I'm kind of looking at at the web right now, and just as an example on Wiki, the genre that they describe it as is first-person shooter, action, role-playing, survival horror video game.
Yeah, which is hitting like 6 out of maybe 10 genres of the time.
Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous.
If they had just put in a couple racing segments and maybe some kind of shooter, flight shooter element,
right? Yeah,
hit them all.
They just needed a vehicle in there someplace.
That's right.
But it's I think a telling thing, because up to that point everything was and it's not the only game, of course, but it's one of the main ones of this era, where up to that point you really the genres were typically very specific, and you knew what each one was. And I think kind of in this era, and you and I offline kind of talked about 1998 as well as being another kind of pivotal year, but around these years the genres started to really they became harder and harder to find, and be pure. And I think that's a good thing. You see progression, and you see RPG elements kind of everywhere now, and being one of my favorite genres in RPGs, I think that's definitely a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, that was actually one of the things we talked about, and I think this game was largely an influence in making that decision. But when we looked at Jedi Starfighter, we talked about incorporating RPG elements into that game. And I think this was probably a strong argument for that. We simply didn't have the time from the company to be able to do that. We had nowhere near the time we would have needed to do that. But it was something we considered quite strongly, even before Starfighter shipped.
I think, and I think we talked about it with Republic Commando as well early on.
That's true. Yep.
Scoping what it was, we ended up focusing on different goals, but yeah, it had a big, and it's not just us, it's all over the place, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're certainly in these latest, generation Tomb Raider games, you're seeing it as well. So that this sort of adding in these elements to other games has definitely come forward. And actually, from the other direction, the Bethesda games started out as much more hard role-playing games and less about the first-person experience, and have been pulling the first-person experience in. Whereas I think this game kind of pulled it from the opposite direction, starting with strong shooter, sort of first-person elements and pulling in the RPG stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really excellent point. Your point about this being Irrational's first game is excellent, and it's interesting. And until we started playing again, it actually didn't dawn on me. But both Looking Glass and Irrational are credited, and I don't know, and I'm hoping maybe we can get somebody on who can talk about that. But it's interesting that both were involved somehow.
They were. So I think that Irrational was, of course, recently founded at the time. And from what I understand, both teams at both companies worked on this game. So, of course, the Thief Dark Engine, which is largely a renderer, but also some game stuff, they had gotten that from Looking Glass, and Ken Levine had been involved at Looking Glass. On Thief, I think he had done the original design or something like that.
I think his writer,
and writing, and that game has a very strong writing element as well. Really comes through with the character of Garrett. So I think they had that sort of close connection, and at that time, it would have been pretty expensive to license another engine. In terms of the sort of sales you could expect. So having that close relationship was really healthy. There were other companies that did this at the time, like Naughty Dog and Insomniac, who shared some elements of technology for early PS2 era games, which would have been right around this time.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that uncommon, actually, at this time for more sharing of technology between sort of larger, what would have been fairly large studios at the time, relative to, teams from even 5 years before.
Right.
So it's definitely interesting. The project manager was Jonathan Che, who was also on Freedom Force and Freedom Force 2. And I don't know if he stayed with Irrational beyond that, but he had gone back to Australia, so I don't really recall. They've always had some sort of interesting approaches at Irrational in terms of splitting their teams up and running these projects.
Well, and then as far as sort of recent relevance when it comes to kind of bubbling back into the news, Paul Nareth, which I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right, was the managing director of Looking Glass at the time, I believe. And they've started up Other Side. Is that what they're called? Right, they're new.
Who are making the new System Shock game.
Yep. They got the rights back and hired Warren Spector, and so it's kind of a bit. It's a bit in a buzz right now.
It's definitely in the news, and they had a very successful Kickstarter.
That's right.
And I think the big news in this last week or 10 days has been the return of Warren Spector. To making games proper. He had been running a program, an educational program, I guess at UT Austin, maybe.
Yeah.
Which was meant to train leadership for game development, and he sort of has done that for a couple of years after his company Junction Point was folded by Disney. Maybe 5 years ago. I can't really recall the timeline there, but Epic Mickey 2, I don't think did as well as they had hoped, and they decided that was time.
Yeah, a few things, and I'm kind of I'm refreshing my memory on the credits here. To the point of influence on really Irrational and Looking Glass, both as companies, and this game in particular, as well as the Underworld games and Thief games. You have people like Marc LeBlanc, who worked on this game, who is lead engine programmer, who went on to work on more games like this. Obviously, we talked about Ken Levine. Doug Church is credited on this, as well as the previous game, System Shock, as director and such, with Warren Spector's producer. Doug is at Valve now, but worked on those same sort of genre-merging games that were really focused on first-person, kind of authentic reality. Randy Smith,
simulation,
Randy Smith worked on this. He was the director on the third Thief game, so there's sort of a group of developers, I guess, largely on the East Coast, and then ultimately in Austin when they kind of moved to Ion Storm Warren's Deus Ex games.
Right, and that's when they merge with people like Harvey Smith, who is most recently known for the Dishonored series, which is again, this same sort of thing, which is lots of sort of approaches to play, and supporting those sorts of things with a sort of rich simulation model, which allows for sort of a richness of player verbs. It's not I'm going to simulate the whole world. It's my world knows about fire and my world knows about water, and it's things like that, and not I'm going to simulate everything. It's more I'm choosing a rule set that is really rich and diverse, and you see that there as well with the work that they've done.
Yeah, very player agency based, which again coming off of around this era, coming off of the Quakes and the Dooms of the world and such, when it comes to first-person games, the player agency-wise, there wasn't a lot, to your point, of verbs to deal with there, and adding more of those in. And later, I'm sure we'll talk about the class sort of system that they have in here versus others. And then the other thing that I forgot about until we started playing it again was, to be honest, the really close similarities to what BioShock ended up being.
Absolutely.
Well, I down to the the respawn tubes or what have you. I forget what they were called in BioShock. But it's just there's so many similarities.
Yeah, they're like life stations or something like that. I can't remember. Yeah, something I can't recall. But yeah, so, there are a ton of both design choices that are very informed by System Shock 2, but also story choices, which we probably won't get into much in this discussion because some of the more interesting ones happen later. But they're definitely there. And playing it again, I was reminded, just how present those were. Ken Levine has certain themes and plot devices he really likes to employ.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So interesting formulas.
Yeah, super formative game and relevant in so many different ways. And being such a sort of, I want to say that this one's more influential than the original just because of its reach. I think that this reached more like a couple 100,000 people, whereas the first one I don't think did quite as well.
Yeah.
Neither were sort of home runs. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of units or a million units. However, this was a time when there were more shooters. Whereas the original System Shock and the Ultimate Underworld series were more, were a little bit stranger. They were in the time when there was, for example, Doom, which was a lot faster paced or felt a lot faster paced, even though the bullets didn't move very fast. And this one's just kind of different. It's not just a first-person shooter, and that's a problem that they had even in marketing BioShock. Many years later.
Well, doing research for our first episode and for playing this game, they actually talk about in a few different sources about how Origin had a hard time marketing the original System Shock because of Doom, and they couldn't figure out how to describe it to the users and to the marketers, right? So it ended up getting kind of falsely pigeonholed into that, and they had a hard time convincing people that it wasn't Doom. And then when people would play it, obviously System Shock 1 being my memory of it being more complicated than 2, it was a weird eye opener. That typical thing where the marketing doesn't match what it actually is when you start playing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's more of the sort of primary environment is more puzzly in the sense of you're trying to navigate the environment, and Shodan's a direct antagonist. The enemy, the AI enemy of the first game, setting traps for you and things like that, and turning on cameras, and you need to sort of figure out a way past that. But there's also this cyberpunk interface. It's a really it is a strange game with probably more stuff than it could really manage to hold gamers' attentions with at its time. I think it was honestly just too rich, with as much technical new sort of newness in the tech as well. As a first-person shooter and with mouse look and everything, there was a lot there for gamers to bite off, and I think it was a little bit intimidating when it came out in the early 90s, like 1994.
Yeah, it was for me. I remember as a gamer for sure, and I don't. I'm not even sure I finished System Shock 1. I did Ultima Underworld. I have on my shelf today. I'm looking at it right now. The original box. I mean, it had a big influence on me for sure. But I remember that being, really thick to get through. A lot of different nuance to figuring out how to play that game effectively. But
Right.
but
And I think
really the
that's
genesis of a lot of these ideas that you knew were important somehow.
right.
But
Right.
at the time, I didn't really understand.
Yeah. No, and I would agree. I mean, I think that the thing that held back Ultima Underworld a little bit was it being an Ultima game, because a lot of what you're describing is really a function of Ultima games. Ultima games are often about roving around this world and trying to figure out what you're supposed to do, and particularly with Ultima 4. Just what does it mean to be a virtuous, human in this Ultima world? And I think a lot of the games feel that way. Less so with sort of the later main role-playing games, but which feel almost a little adventure-y with role-playing, where the story is a little bit stronger. But those earlier, like the first 4 Ultima games, are very sprawling.
Yeah.
And not necessarily clear in what you're supposed to do.
Intimidating.
Yeah, and it is. It can be very intimidating. I played them the first few of them last year, and they are very difficult.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Oh, really?
I played 1, 2, and 3 all the way through, and I started playing 4. And I streamed them. They're up on YouTube. You can watch them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I streamed and talked about things and yeah, it's good fun. Go look for my name on YouTube, Brett Duville.
I'll check those out. Yeah, I have fond memories of 3 specifically. I definitely played the hell out of that one, but again, not really grokking, the significance and the opaqueness of it. Yeah.
I think 1 and 3 genuinely hold up pretty well. I mean, they're very dated, obviously graphically, but 2, I don't think was a good game even when it came out. I just did not feel like that one was particularly strong. It was just very, very ill balanced towards the end game. Like, it's just like, oh, and now I need a ton of money, to be able to do this thing. So I just need to grind for hours and hours and hours. So there's, I think I actually skipped over that for the stream and just said, okay, and then 20 hours of doing this happened, and I'll show you what I did for 20 hours. So anyway, we're a little far afield, but I do think that those kind of, those earlier games owed a lot to sort of that, pushing that complexity, and they hadn't found a way or design vocabulary to communicate and narrow down that complexity to the player. Whereas I feel like this one hit a sweet spot with this.
Yep.
And that it's intimidating for other reasons, which I think we'll get into. And I think interesting reasons, to be honest. I mean, I think good reasons, but
yeah, I just think the usability got to a point where it was able to penetrate a different audience than people who were willing, people who were actually willing to go a little bit farther into it rather than kind of put it down so quickly as I think as the others. So
right, absolutely. All right, well, why don't we take a quick break, and then we'll come back and start talking about the sort of first 2 hours of the game, especially dwelling, I think, on the tutorial and some really interesting choices that follow right after it, as well as the sort of beginning of the game proper. Sound good? All right.
Look at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine?
Welcome back from the break. We're going to tackle right now actually playing the game. So System Shock 2 starts off kind of with a tutorial, and then we're going to play and talk about up to essentially where you enter the R&D section of the Von Braun, the ship that you're on. So basically ending at the end of the crew quarters after you've achieved the ability to move on. So, Tim, tell me a little bit about the opening of this game.
Yeah, so it's funny, obviously memory is a funny thing, and I have a terrible memory, so I don't ever remember anything. So coming back into it, there are just, you and I were both talking about a little bit in the break, that there's just a lot of surprises that I just really forgot about. even just something simple as you wake up in a cryotube, etc. And there's some amnesia stuff thrown in there and some tropes that I had forgotten about. And I remembered that there was a tutorial that was pretty elaborate for tutorials in a shooter those days, kind of necessary for this kind of game. But then the sort of class choices and the way that, as you were saying earlier, they wrap that stuff in kind of a narrative wrapper lightly, but again, stuff that only really the Half-Lives of the world had really touched in a first-person sense in those days. And there were some others, but they were these guys were the ones and gals were the ones doing it at all. And it just caught me off guard, because I just had forgotten about how much emphasis and time they put into that. And it was effective because there's some, even though they made improvements from System Shock 1 when it comes to how opaque things are, there definitely are some things in here that needed it, and I just kind of applaud them for actually putting the time into that stuff in this era.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to set the stage, you start off and you're in this large, sort of very vacant kind of building. Although there are a couple rooms where you can see through a window and you can see people in there.
Pretty hilarious, though.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's very, very.
Sparse.
It's very sparse, but it's also like brutalist. Like it's the ceilings are impossibly high, and it's like it feels like an edifice. And it's called, I think, the UNN, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So and you hop on a monorail, and at this point, because it hasn't really taught you anything about the world, you don't even get sort of interaction boxes and things like that. Although you can still go around and use things, like you can go and the phones. In that area, you can actually go and click on them and things like that.
Oh, serious? I went up to them and I didn't even...
There was no indication that you could do something, but
you can.
It turns out you can, yeah.
Oh, nice. Okay.
It's funny. And they just play a little, basically hold music and a little voice line. But there's not much to it, but there is more to it even than is on the surface. And like I said, there is a room where two people are having a meeting or something like that. But it is really
that's a meeting going on.
Yeah,
standing there looking at each other.
Yeah, it is extremely sparse. But it takes you, you hop on that monorail or whatever subway, and it takes you to what is basically the tutorial area. You want to set that up a little bit. You mentioned class choices, which I think are the most important part of that.
Yeah, I mean, they talk about you joining this, UNN or United Nations. I'm actually not even sure what it stands for. I didn't notice that, but a military kind of ish organization, and they start introducing you to different wings of that. So there's the Marines, there's the Navy, and there's the ops, the Sci ops kind of thing, which I didn't write down the name of the Sci.
Yeah, it's not called PsyOps. It's the Unified National Nominate, which is an awfully weird name, and it is called Psy. It's OSA.
Okay, I knew it was ops or something. Ops.
Yeah, it is PsyOps that you are doing, but the actual group is called the OSA. I have no idea. I guess that's supposed to reflect like the CIA, like your intelligence or something.
Yeah, more of the spy side of things.
Exactly, right. So it is these sort of three classes, which is really, really kind of unique for, a shooter at this time. Looking at Half-Life, that was definitely one specific guy, and it wouldn't be for years that you saw more of this with things like usually online shooters, team play shooters like Wolfenstein. I forget what that was called, but the goal-based multiplayer.
Enemy territory.
Enemy territory, exactly.
Yeah.
I guess that was Wolfenstein.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That was the franchise essentially. Yeah.
And so normally sort of class distinctions in players were more in first-person shooters were more about like weapons you preferred. It was literally in the player to make those choices and not supported by the game directly, Yeah. And that's very different here.
Yeah, I mean, there were, I would say, like, Team Fortress Classic would have come out before this as one example, as the mod for Quake 1. And I remember playing the hell out of that. But it wasn't presented in. And first of all, that was a mod. But it wasn't presented in this way, right? As integrated of a way into the actual first person experience like this. As if you were playing an RPG. I remember you and I and Reed when we were on Starfighter playing this, and I remember us talking about. It was kind of one of the first times when I remember talking about and asking each other which class we chose. You know what I mean? Which wasn't really a conversation you would have about shooters, very, very much at that time. And
absolutely.
Therefore, the water cooler talk would be very much about like, okay, what's your experience with this? What's your experience? And they were inevitably, because of our choices, going to be very different. And you and I talked about this when we started the game. Okay, which one are you going to pick? And we both chose ones we didn't choose when we played the game the first time.
And we both remembered what we chose the first time.
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah, it's memorable, and because I think it so differentiates how you end up playing, that I think that to a degree that's really surprising, to be honest. And I guess we'll get to that pretty shortly.
Yeah.
So we move from there and we go through this really weird what feels. It was totally forgettable. I had completely forgotten the next aspect of the game, which was going through a series of, short levels where basically you choose A, B, or C, which are different sorts of ways your character is going to get buffed. But it's a little bit more involved than that, right?
Yeah, you mean the virtual.
Once you've chosen a class, you kind of go off, and now you're given missions.
Yeah.
That are 1-year assignments, and each of these end up giving you some sort of skill benefit. And I played a Marine, which is sort of the heavy guy. He plays, uses weapons. And I think this time out you're playing the Sci, the OSA character.
Yep.
And you go in and you're given choices like, well, do you want to go to this ship and learn about heavy weaponry, or do you want to learn about light weaponry on this other ship? Or maybe you want to go and do maintenance on at a third location, and get a boost to some, hacking stat or, maintenance stat of some kind. And that's really unusual. I can't remember another game that did basically what was skill allocation in most RPGs, that would be just part of a dialogue box, a page where you set up your character and allocated points. Right, a menu. Right. I mean, usually it's just, hey, you have 10 points and you can pick one perk or whatever, like the original Fallout. This is very different from that.
Yeah, and I made a note too that one of the fun things about it, which I'd forgotten for sure, was each of my three sections had different voice actor for each of them as you walk into the hallway, and it instantly gives you this sort of tone or persona for that little section. You know what I mean? And for the OSA, as you may remember, it had, there were sort of 3 experts that you were going for each of your year tours of duty to go learn and train with. They were the expert in this type of psionics or this type of psionics, and that was the kind of wrapper for it. And it was just glorified, virtual ops, of training. But it was enough of kind of a motivation and that fictional wrapper where it draws you in right away, and you feel like you're going on this kind of multi-year version. And I had forgotten about the year time slicing that was going on too, and the super simple and super basic way that they implemented it, but it gives you the sense that you're kind of cooler than you should be because you've been training for like 3 or 4 years, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm so ready for this.
Right, yeah, it makes sense.
For 3 years,
I've been learning stuff, right? I'm ready. I can handle anything.
yeah, I've been doing is walking through these hallways that look, like Tron. So it's cool. Yeah.
One of the things about it though is that, like any other RPG, you really have no idea how important one or the other of those skills will be.
Oh yeah, it's terrible.
And so you basically have to make a decision based on maybe some sort of gamer knowledge of like, well, I know that, there's probably going to be a point in the game where I can get those heavy weapons earlier if I have the skill and I can use them, and that'll be a good leg up, some number of hours in, or I know that, it's always good to have some sort of minimal hacking skill. You might have sort of that gamer knowledge, but there isn't really anything in the game that is telling you this is going to be valuable.
Yep.
On the other hand, right, I mean, if it sort of feels like this game is rich enough that maybe it doesn't matter which one you choose, you just have to use whatever skills you have to try to survive.
Yeah, I think that's your hope at the time. And I think, I probably should think of some really good examples for this, but from this game and a little bit before it, onward, various games try this stuff, right? And some of them do it better than others, and some of them do it really poorly. And it's a really, it's a tricky thing to do, to not make the player feel like they're missing out. And I mean, we'll talk about this more and more as we play the game, but I actually think that one of sort of the educational flaws in this particular game is the trickiness of the way they did this. And I'll give you an example in a bit about sort of some of my realization as I chose Sci, and I was a hacker the first time I played, and when I got in and remembered what I liked about hacking and what I now can't do.
Exactly.
The frustration with that.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And, having worked on a couple of RPGs, I can say a lot of that comes down to, individual designers who are really willing to push forward that particular aspect of play. And so if you have designers who are really behind, in this game, I would say obviously they had somebody who was really behind hacking, and I would say that the combat, of course, is already there and kind of gains, and brings something over from Thief, and even some animations, I think, in some cases.
Yeah.
And I think that you need, if you're going to have that sort of wide variety of choice as a developer, you need to feel like I'm going to have people who are going to champion, that are going to cover championing all of those different options. Because if you don't, you risk having that thing. One example I always used to give back then is, like, you may remember, I used to like to play like Baldur's Gate or whatever as a bard.
Yeah.
And those games are not well suited to bards. I don't know if they've balanced that since, but they're not well suited to sort of a character that never goes very deep in one area.
Yep.
Right? And I think this game is better about that for sure. Because and we can talk about that as we encounter, and certainly we'll see more of that as we play deeper into the game. But it's the same sort of thing where if you've been playing RPGs, you're fearful of, like, how am I going to get screwed in these choices? Because you don't know what's coming.
Yeah, there's a trust there, right? There's a risk that you're taking, and you have to trust the developer that that they're going to accommodate you, and I'm sure we'll talk about Deus Ex 1 here and there as we go, and maybe we'll play that in the future or something. But that's another interesting style of how to accomplish this, and in my opinion, I think Deus Ex ended up succeeding in some of this in different ways and solving this problem because it was more player-driven and the level design was different. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And they sort of meet out the choices a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
So, and they're more sort of binary, and less sort of number crunchy. It's like, how many points am I going to put into this or that?
Yeah, to your point about the designer who is rallying behind and really the one that's shepherding one of these systems forward. Because I hadn't played the psionics until this time, in one of the information kiosks that they have, that you can go up to, and they give you, basically the in-world hint set system.
Yep.
They even talk about for the psionics one in that psionics are more complicated and harder to understand. I forget what this wording was. I should have written it down, but like they warn you that if you take this, it's more complicated. And I start getting into the system, and I'd totally forgotten about that being so true. And I could totally see the designer who's going into the system like, and then we could do this, and then we have these 5 tabs, and then there's all this stuff in every tab, and wow, like it really. And I'm not remembering now what hacking had, and maybe hacking is that complicated, but I don't think it was that complicated.
I don't know. I don't feel that it was. I think that the size stuff really is the most complicated. because it's basically magic, right? And so it's, well, what do we feel like doing, and what can the system support and things like that, and yeah, playing it through the first time, that was particularly brutal for me as I got to the end game.
Chose. Yeah.
I chose that, and I played back in those days. I was a real gamer, and I played on higher levels of difficulty, and I really paid for that with this game.
Well, and then I have this. I'm really interested to track it as we play, and as I'm going through with the Sci, and I definitely have anxiety about it because I'm worried that I see some signs, some early predictions that I have, and signs about choices I'm making in the way that it looks like the design is laid out. That I might. It's one of those games where I think I can make wrong choices, based on maybe my play style, but also based on the design, the level design, or the enemy design and stuff. And so I'm trying to be mindful of that, but I worry that there's the ye old, I can make a bad build for myself, and that build will screw me for the rest of the time, and I'm kind of worried about that right now as I'm seeing all of those options in front of me.
Yeah, I think we'll get, I can think of an immediate example that we'll get to sort of right after we talk about the real opening, once you actually get up to the Von Braun.
Mm-hmm.
So the Von Braun, I guess, is the ship you're going out to rescue, basically, right?
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about that. I watched the intro and the intro movie and kind of the the narrated one, and read a couple things multiple times because I still am not sure I don't remember what the Rickenbacker is doing. They're docking?
Yes, I think the Rickenbacker is docking, but I honestly, yeah, it's not really clear. It is very unclear.
It's docking, and then we go into the Von Braun, and it's in trouble. Clearly, there's trouble going on there.
Right.
But we don't go through the Rickenbacker to get there, right?
That's correct, yeah. And in fact, and I think the Rickenbacker stuff becomes a lot clearer later.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. Yeah.
I know that it's really important at maybe the last third of the game, that the Rickenbacker really comes into play. So I'm not really entirely clear, but part of not being clear is it seems like from the intro sort of cinematic to the sort of after the post tutorial and these sort of RPG choices we talked about, you're treated to a cutscene where it establishes some things like you've been on this station for a little while, and they put you back in cryo freeze, and you have amnesia.
Yes.
What is going on there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll say convenient, but some convenient, tropes there to help the the player inhabit the avatar so they can create mystery and reset things, because this is a sequel, right? And I
guess that saves them the problem of getting you there.
Yeah, right.
So you're not arriving in another shuttle and all those sorts of things. You've actually just been there for some period of time, maybe 6 months or whatever. So I guess that makes a certain amount of story sense. But
it helps. I mean, you and I both know that opening moment of any game, especially if it's a sequel, is always a tricky and weird one. I mean, trust me, we just shipped Halo 5, right? And it's like, how do you start with players, who want to be introduced to the game in a not overwhelming way? You want to give them, again, like some sort of avatar that is not a clean slate, but something that is, not going to overwhelm them with, I don't know what's going on, I don't know where I am or who I am.
Right, and that's very hard. Yeah, and the amnesia thing definitely does that. The other thing too is I think that, knowing a little bit about the original System Shock storyline, I know it's possible that not everybody would know this much time later what actually happened there. They just, this guy would be, this character you're playing would be, early 20s tops, right? I mean, he just enrolled in the military, right? So he's a young person, presumably. Right. So he's not going to know something that happened, say, 20 years ago or 40 years ago in any kind of detail. He's not going to know why the Tri-Optimum company dissolved and
got it. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Right. So it's sort of by resetting the player with the character with amnesia, it brings the player into the same place. Well, hey, you didn't play this game. If you did play the game, then you're going to pick up, oh, it's the UNN, but then when I'm in the main menu, I see Trioptimum in the screen, and like you get all those sort of ties, but you don't have to. And
Right.
having the character be an amnesiac kind of gives you that sort of referential point of being like, oh, it's okay that I don't know these things. Like,
it helps with what have you, the narrative dissidence, the problem of the player and the character knowing different things. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
because I mean, not to jump ahead, but there's some messages on the walls and sort of blood smeared graffiti about Citadel,
right,
station and stuff like that, which was in the first one, I believe, right? And,
yep.
And you may know what that is, or you will find out what that is as you play System Shock 2.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so it's good. It's good, and those things can be a mystery, or you can have a kind of glimmer, like, oh, okay, yeah, that's right, I'm in System Shock 2. You might already have an idea, even if you hadn't played the original one, that some of these things might tie in. But and certainly as things develop, that's true. So a few things that I, just moving around in this environment that I'd kind of entirely forgotten about. The environment actually affords more things than were common at the time. So ladders, for sure, although Half-Life had ladders, I believe. And then just mantling, being able to climb up on anything, which is, I guess, probably came from Thief. But they're kind of bringing in things sort of from different worlds. And I think that the sort of Thief technology really allowed them to do that, right? I mean, that's what the Dark Engine was able to do that was kind of new.
Yep.
So that whole first section is really this scramble. And I know both of us noticed how much like Alien it felt.
Yeah.
It feels like the end of Alien in a way, in that, that something's chasing you. At least that's what you're told. And you're sort of scrambling around this environment, getting through this thing that's falling apart. Just like Ripley has to cross across the whole ship and then cross the whole way back in order to, I don't know, do something, to make her able to get off the station. I don't even really remember in Alien.
Yeah, I think it was self-destruct. No, that was already triggered. Yeah, I don't remember either.
Yeah,
but yeah, there was some device there.
Yeah, but it does feel Alien-like, at least in that sort of. It's very pulse pounding. It's really pushing you forward. Like, keep doing this thing. Like, you've got to get to this. You've got to get to that. And it feels that way in Alien. Like, I don't have a lot of time here, and the same thing is going on here.
Vulnerable and solitary. The solitude there. Very, very influenced by that stuff, and the themes as well. Like, you could immediately see this as one of their things.
You're definitely, you're also talking to this disembodied voice, which was part of Alien, although it wasn't kind of throughout the ship as much. But there was that element as well. I remember that
the computer you talked about?
Yeah, the computer that she could talk to, and that I guess Chris Christopherson talked to. No, not Chris Christopherson.
No, what's his name?
He looks just like him. Tom
Skerritt?
Tom Skerritt, yeah.
Yeah.
Tom Skerritt talked to, and then ultimately Ripley talked to. It's all that.
Mother? Was that what?
Yeah, Mother. Yes, yeah. Mother is in Alien. That's right. So it has that sort of like, oh, this person I'm talking to, I can't remember this person. She's a doctor. She's telling me where to go. And of course, these sorts of things will come up in later games as well from Ken Levine. How about that? Interesting. We'll talk about that more later, I'm sure. But it's pretty. I mean, it's pretty interesting and urgent. I know at this point we sort of look down on the constant, reference to and reverence of only a few specific science fiction films. Star Wars, Star Trek, Blade Runner, Alien, pretty much covering the whole gamut. And maybe Mad Max these days. But at this time, I think that was less an issue
Right. It wasn't as much of a meme, if you will, or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it was certainly already still a trope, but we were so busy developing both technology and also just design vocabularies and sort of like, I don't know, best practices for these sorts of things, that was sort of a thing that was like, it's good if we can lean on something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and get you down the road more quickly, right? Things that will. I mean, we didn't scrutinize. I mean, to your point about we don't know how many copies this game sold, but it was just the economy of scale then was just completely different than it is now, right? And so the sort of due diligence that you would do about franchises in general is completely different, right? It was more acceptable and really I think players like us at the time enjoy experiencing an alien type experience in a video game because we just hadn't done it yet, you know.
Yeah.
And the more that happened, especially after this game, the more it was familiar and the more we felt like it was a ripoff or what have you, and there needed to be some unique spin on it. It's just way more acceptable then because it was, you know, it's still a pretty fresh industry overall, you know, really.
Yeah.
Truthfully.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You know, I think that, you know, that is definitely something that's changed a lot in the couple decades since we started, you know, as developers and certainly much longer as players. You know, it's really, you know, certain things are very well mined now. And we'll continue to mine them because, you know, people, you know, there's still people who are young coming up who haven't had those experiences. There's always going to be those people. So there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, even now. But it is, at this time, this may have been the first game I played that had sort of that alien feeling.
It's the first one I can remember.
Yeah.
You know, definitely the moodiness of things was happening here and there. You know, Quake 1 and 2 and stuff, I think were some early kind of immersive shooter experiences. But yeah, it was. I think that's why it hit on so many cylinders at this time. And Thief and Half-Life both, right? The previous year we were talking about.
Right.
So both also very immersive and tonally very pure, you know.
Right. Yeah, and I want to say in those cases really trying something actually a little bit different, you know.
Yeah.
So they were already, you know, kind of breaking out in that way. But yeah, totally makes sense to lean on those sorts of things at this point. Certainly anything earlier than this was leaning on things or was so abstract that it really could be labeled anything, right? You know, and so it's kind of interesting.
Know, for this first section, I think even though the game is holding up surprisingly well for me so far, I definitely had forgotten about some of the things that I probably forgave quite a bit. I forgave it for quite a bit at the time. It's a pretty, it's a very, very sparse game, like you were talking about earlier. You know, like there is just nothing around,
right?
And it's very simple, and I guess it's all hindsight 20. You know, like just your memories being wrong. I just remember Half-Life being a year before, having more going on. But I have a feeling that if I were to go back to play Half-Life 1 right now, it would be the same thing. But just I don't know. It's just we've come so far in just this amount of time. It just kind of caught me off guard at first about how minimalistic of an experience it really was, you know. But the good thing about that for me so far in this playthrough is when something happens, it almost has more meaning and more impact on me because it's so sparse around it, you know. So
right, and I guess it's good too because that allows for more richness in the systems themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because you have so many options as the player. You know, you start out and you're either, you know, sci guy, hack guy, or gun guy. Mm-hmm. In my case, you know, gun guy. Although, for much of the first part of the game, I tried to use the wrench, another Bioshock staple for that matter.
Oh, yeah.
But I tried to hold on to that wrench and use that as much as possible because I knew, having played it before, my guns were not going to last as long as I wanted them to.
Yeah.
You know, and so that would be my strategy going in. But a hacker might go in and be able to immediately start turning systems to their advantage, or just simply have more resources to to maybe level up, skills faster. Like there are boxes and crates and things I still haven't been able to get into because I'm not willing to invest or haven't had the resources to invest in sort of leveling up hacking instead of something else.
Yeah, that's my segue to my point I was going to make. I was alluding to earlier, just because I played a hacker the first time, and whenever I play games like this, I often go in that direction because I'm a completionist, and I hate not being able to get into things or open things or control things. And the same thing for all the Bethesda games. It's typically one of the things that I try to go after, and so it's very hard for me to choose this other path and try and do the silence thing because I know there's stuff in those boxes that I really would like to have, and therein lies kind of, I'll keep, like I said, I'll keep an eye on it and I'll bring it up, throughout the episodes hopefully, but just that concept of I think it is actually a flaw that the choices and the paths that they have for each of the three classes in some cases is pretty extreme, and the crossover between those, which I think Deus Ex as an evolution of this did a better job in, the crossover of those is pretty unforgiving.
Yeah, I would totally agree. In fact, the first thing I wanted to put any sort of skill points into was hacking, because I'm the same way. I hate not being able to open up a box, right? I can see it; it's there. And the same thing happens with the research. Which is another sort of big area that I had actually entirely forgotten about.
Totally forgot. Yep.
I totally forgot. It is basically, so to set it up for people who maybe haven't got to this point yet, you can occasionally find basically, I guess, body parts in these creatures you encounter, the enemies in the game. And you can hold on to them, and then with chemicals in certain research stores throughout the space station, you can actually figure out what they are, and I believe you can get some benefit from them. So maybe
I don't remember.
Yeah, I believe that if you research something enough, then it will give you progressively better benefits to heal you or to recover. In your case, psi power would be good. I think monkey brains are good for that. A little pro tip.
Yep. I picked a couple of those up.
Right, and but that is locked off to you at the outset, and I'm not even sure it is possible, and I would have to go back and check, but I'm not sure that's actually available to you as an option starting the game. Like, I don't think you could choose a path through that offers that to you.
You mean as a psionics guy?
Regardless, I don't think any of the player classes let you become a researcher. I think that's something you have to pick up on the station.
Okay, yeah, I can't do it right now. I found the chemicals and I remembered them, but I can't. I haven't accessed anything. I have some monkey brains and some zombie parts and stuff.
Yeah. So the first thing that sort of struck me is that once you get kind of past the pell-mell, really sort of an extension of the tutorial, like, hey, you've been in sort of these simulated, very simple environments that are abstract. That sort of initial section is, we've set the stage. We're going to give you a task. I don't think there's actually any real time pressure. It's just a feeling of time pressure. And then you get into an area that is actually, it's free to move about in, and it's open, and you have to do kind of the sorts of things you're going to have to do for the rest of the game, to some degree, before you even run into some bad guys.
You're talking about the science.
Yeah, right when you get in there, and there's a way to level up your character right away, and you get a little benefit. You get some resources to be able to, if you want to up your skills, you can do that then. It's still early. I held them back because I was like, I don't know what's coming next. I don't remember. So I want to make that decision after I've had a chance to see.
So I was going to ask you what you upgraded. So you didn't upgrade anything there.
I didn't originally. I went into the next section a bit, and picked up some more, and then came back and picked up hacking because, like I said, that just drives me nuts. Mm-hmm. And in particular, there's like security cameras and things like that. So the sort of different skills you need right there are pretty variable. Hacking is good to have pretty early on. You definitely would like to be able to use a gun and certainly be able to swing the wrench. As a Marine, I have high strength, and so the wrench is pretty good for me. There's the environmental navigation, but you're also learning like, oh, this is how lifts work, and there's actually a little section which I thought was very clever that taught you that parts of the world are breakable.
Yep.
You go up into a little area and there's a dead body, and as you go up this ramp, you can hear some breaking glass, and you come around the corner and you can see there's some stuff that you can't get to unless you swing the wrench and break the glass. Or if you had a gun, I think you could do that too. So it teaches you about that. So it's like it's trying to teach you sort of about what the simulation is about at that point, as well as setting the stage as being like just this totally creepy area.
Yeah.
And it's pretty gross. Like there's a point where you walk in and there's a guy hanging, and just like it's pretty.
Well, yeah, and they just as far as like early, and this is something that I think BioShock 1 was one of my favorite games in recent memory that did this really well too. But as far as visual storytelling goes, in this era, even though, like I was saying, it's a very sparse game and it's minimalistic, what they do use with their visual storytelling creeps the hell out of you, and just simple things like people hanging, like you said, or some of the audio logs, which we'll probably get to in a bit here, and just economical storytelling, I guess, and that's what they had to, at their disposal, and so you kind of got to work with what you have, of course, but pretty effective, in those days, and the audio design, also fairly simple but effective, I thought.
Yeah, but very effective, especially for how much it underlines sort of the sort of things that we're talking about, like this being abandoned, and even the sparseness, I think, works in that direction. Like, you don't feel... It's a different feeling from Alien, in that Alien feels like there's tons of stuff. It's just all broken stuff from the ship. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of personal stuff. So in that sense, it sort of is kind of similar in that way. Like, the world is sparse, but it's like, well, how much stuff are they going to bring up to the space station? I mean, you have to... Anything that's there, you got to bring there. So it does sort of make a certain amount of sense, but it does... I mean, I agree. It totally feels a little sparse, just in terms of interactable elements, but...
To your point about the breakable duck thing and that kind of stuff, I'd forgotten about that, and since once they teach you that, I'm hitting the hell out of all the ducks I see. I'm not even sure why, but I'm like,
just want to know. It could be. You're a completionist.
There could be a hypo up there that I want, and I don't think they ever do that, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Probably just going to be some potato chips. I'm just going to tell you now.
Speaking of swinging things, like, oh man, that wrench. Like, I really would love to ask them how intentional the tuning is on that thing, because it's so slow and it builds so much, ultimately it ends up working out well because it builds such great tension when you're fighting an enemy. But timing, and they also swing fairly slowly at you, the which we haven't talked about, but the zombie kind of characters.
Right.
But just great tension. And how many hits does it take you to take one down?
Takes me 2.
Okay, it takes me 2 as well. So,
okay. So that's not a big differentiator. Which is funny. I was like, oh, this will be good. I'll be able to do this a little faster. But it's turned out not to be the case. Mm-hmm. I did invest some of those resources I've talked about back into like pistol damage and things like that, because I know I'll have some pistols for a while. Sure. Just because that's the way a first-person shooter works, right? You get better and better guns.
Yeah.
But yeah, through that whole first section, as you first get introduced to those zombies, these zombie creatures walking around mostly with wrenches themselves, I would try to run up, let them do a swing and then hit them while they were, in their post-swing. But you have to start your swing, sort of as you're backing away. Otherwise, it's by the time you get the swing off, he's going to also be swinging again. And you'll probably take damage, especially on that first, the first hit of 2.
Yeah, I just had forgotten that there was any... I mean, yeah, you can spam if you want, but you're not going to be successful. I just had forgotten that there actually is a bit of a little timing element to it, and I'm sure it was intentional on the tuning side, and it seems very animation-driven, which is maybe part of... I believe I remember Thief having the same thing with like the blackjack and stuff, right, where it might have been a little bit faster, but there was a timing element to it, and maybe that's part of the Dark Engine, but it's a nice kind of subtle tuning in there that gives you a little bit more tactical decision making, I guess.
Right. Yeah, and the guards in Thief were much the same way.
That's right.
They had these slow
swing.
Swings.
Sure.
And the way the guy walks around, the zombies walk around with the wrench up in the air is exactly like a guard with a torch.
That's right. Oh, you're right. I totally forgot about that.
Yep, that's exactly. I imagine it's exactly the same animation, to be honest.
Well, the walk animation on the humans is identical.
Is identical as well. Yeah, a lot of sharing of resources back then. These days, every game you kind of kick that stuff off again, but back then there was a lot more economy.
Yeah, I do. I kind of, to be honest, miss that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a constraint thing, right? There were a lot of constraints in game development. All right, we're running up on at least a half hour here in this segment, so let's wind up. I think it's important to talk a little bit about the storytelling, and then maybe we'll talk about the storytelling mechanisms, and then maybe we'll take a quick break and a short segment just to sort of set up the next episode. So go, tell me about these audio logs.
Yeah, so I don't know if you'd read about this, but I'd found a little tidbit about this doing a little bit of research before the episode. That is a little bit blowing my mind. And it was a concept they started in System Shock 1, I believe. So these audio logs, which are a common thing we find in games these days, right? You pick them up, and they're telling, essentially their main vehicle for storytelling is listening to these audio logs after the fact of these characters that are seemingly dead or not around right now. There are no living characters to tell the story with. There's no cinematics or cutscenes or anything like that. It's all essentially environmental storytelling and picking up these audio logs. And something they did heavily in BioShock as well, and Ken Levine seems to kind of do through all of his first person stuff, is you begin creating this history with these characters through their audio logs, and there's a beginning, middle, and end seems to be forming throughout the logs themselves. So the names are typically fairly recognizable, and the faces, so you'll remember them, and they'll start telling these sort of threads of stories that obviously are going to thread through what happened to the ship. I vaguely remember and assume, and it's just a really nice, obviously easy and economical way to do it, but probably fit their budget, etc. But the tidbit I found that I think is a quote, I won't quote because I don't get the quote wrong, but it was from Doug Church on System Shock 1, and the decision, had you heard about this?
No,
decision they had made between Ultima Underworld and System Shock. In Ultima Underworld, there were dialogue trees and selection that you could choose what your responses to the other NPCs would be. They actually chose to take those out intentionally between Ultima Underworld and System Shock 1 because they felt like it hurt immersion and realism.
Interesting.
They didn't want, every time that dialogue box came up and you were choosing your selection, they felt like that was breaking you out of the experience. So in System Shock 1, they added these audio logs in to accommodate that same storytelling, but to have more ownership over the immersion that the player was going to feel. And I think that is fascinating and hilarious to me because these days it's like we've almost flipped the other way, right? Where audio logs are the crutch, and then if you don't have some sort of selectable dialogue or something, which there's Uncharted 4 apparently has something like that in it.
Really?
That they've talked about. Yeah, they showed it in one of the gameplay trailers.
Oh my goodness!
Which is hilarious to me because it's like like if you don't have that, then you feel like you're not doing enough. And now audio logs are like the crutch. And so it was fascinating to me that back then they thought that
that audio logs were basically a solution to a problem. Well, I totally get where they're coming from. Like,
totally.
You're stopping and you're using 1, 2, and 3 on the keyboard, or you're using the joystick to select something, and it reminds you that you don't actually have a verb to speak, right? You don't actually have a real, I can't actually interact in that way as the player with the world. I have this kind of artificial mechanism it's
an interface.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's an interface barrier, right? And that goes back to RPGs of the time, right? So, the original Fallout. And these days, with dialogue trees, and certainly in Fallout 4, the goal was to try to make that more realistic. That you also see this in the Mass Effect series, so that you see the characters having these conversations and they're doing things that feel natural, so that you kind of try to overcome that barrier by making it acting better,
Right.
or making it more reactive. In Fallout 4, it was like you can turn and walk away at any time and things like that. So there are different solutions to the problem, but, and I know here's an even lower fidelity one. There's a new indie game out called Oxenfree, and you can interrupt and kind of sort of say, yeah, I get it, get to the next thing. As a player, you want to have that affordance, and they've recorded a lot of extra audio to support the player kind of skipping ahead or skipping to a different topic and things like that. So they've literally recorded, overloaded the audio with a lot of different sort of responses and things like that. So there's lots of different solutions we have today, owing to resources, really.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't imagine doing that back then and putting all that on a CD.
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
So
I
it's
just thought it was
interesting. And certainly
fascinating.
System Shock, the original System Shock, would have even been on discs, I bet.
Right. Yeah.
So.
It's just fascinating to me that was their. When I found that, I couldn't believe it, really, truthfully, because we have these conversations currently today about that kind of conundrum of, well, yeah, I mean, everybody uses audio logs or whatever, and it's kind of just become like I said, a crutch, and we, those, and there's, like you said, I've heard good things about Oxenfree, by the way, as far as their dialogue system and such, and I'm glad that people are kind of cracking the nut in different ways. It's just hilarious.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I really respect Doug Church as well. I think he definitely has a lot of his underpinnings are throughout these games, and he's a really smart thinker on this stuff. So it's funny that was their motivation.
Yeah.
But anyway,
that's great.
So that's the how they're revealing what's going on the ship, and then the other point I was going to make is the as far as storytelling goes, there's this Xerxes computer that is introduced. Do you explain that a little bit? I don't.
Yeah, sure. So Xerxes seems like the basically the operating system for the space station, and he appears as an old man. You can't see him except in one location where his image is available on a monitor.
Right.
We haven't even touched on the ghosts. Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah, right. Talk about those.
Yeah, we get so much to cover. I think this segment's going to be longer than I thought. Anyway, so the Xerxes is basically, in a certain sense, is your antagonist. You've got these zombies moving around, but he's what's preventing you being able to go from one section to the other. You're basically trying to override his desires. He's shut down the system. He's enabled the security systems and the turrets and the cameras and things like that because of this sort of infection. But he's not able to sort of tell that you're different, which is in itself kind of interesting and maybe foreshadowing. I don't remember that specifically, but it sort of feels like it, talking about it.
Could be, yeah, I don't remember either.
But he's the machine running the ship. And he will, I think, we'll talk more about him, I think, next time, because I think his role as an antagonist, will become a little clearer, and he'll be part of a bigger story beat for sure.
And then the ghosts, like you said.
Right. Yeah, that's the weirdest thing. And I think, so the thing about the ghosts, so at different points in the game, you have sort of flashbacks, and they're not fully explained. They're described by the narrator who's been talking in your ear and telling you where to go and what to do. She tells you that they're after images having to do with the technology in your neural interface or something like that. Basically the cyberpunk.
Oh, that's right.
So she says, well, these things you're seeing these things because of your interface. It's not really clear whether these ghosts are ghosts in a literal sense of like these are spirits that you're seeing and perceiving just because you have this augmented ability, or if they're actually maybe some kind of feedback from the actual computer systems of the ship. You know what I mean? So it's like you're seeing what the cameras saw before, and picking up things like that. But they appear at different points and are basically telling a backstory of how we got to where we are now. Like in the way that you might get a sense from audio logs in BioShock of like, this is what these people were before they became splicers. You're getting the same thing here of, I'm getting to see these people in these situations that look a little more normal, except that they're ghosts. But it's like, here's the thing that happened just before this guy died, and here's the thing. This is this person learning that they can't get into something that they wanted to get into, and so they feel threatened, and maybe they die soon after. Or this machine doesn't work anymore. So they work in a lot of different functions. There are obvious storytelling functions, but they sometimes are just there to remind you, hey, you can do this thing. Like there's a ghost. What prompted me to even remember them was, one of them turns up right next to where Xerxes is seen, and I
remember that one.
The ghost is banging on this vending machine and saying, somebody's always, breaking into these things, and I can't, it's broken. I can't get my money's worth or whatever. And so he's upset, but it has a nice function of reminding you, oh yeah, these are hackable things too. Like any machine in the world is in theory hackable. So you have the opportunity to hack in and maybe, I think in those cases, lower the prices of things. I haven't done that yet. So it's interesting the different ways that this game tries to reinforce the wide variety of player choice you have.
Yeah, they have a few devices that bled into the game that they use multiple times. They have the information kiosks, which I think are a little bit too much of a crutch, which that you just click on the wall and read.
Yeah,
and those are basically tutorials. Yeah, and such. And then, but yeah, those ghosts, I had actually totally forgotten about them until the first one happened, and had a little mini fright there when it did. But I just I have a terrible memory anyway, so every one of these things that I keep, happening upon and then remembering that they're actually existing was pretty hilarious. But to throw out a couple things like, again, the similarities to BioShock I had completely forgotten. We have the health tubes. There's, the all of the upgrades.
Quantum entanglement devices, I think is the word you're looking for.
Yep, that's not what I would have remembered. Yeah, and then obviously the light RPG elements. There's the health tables where you can go and heal yourself up, and then just because of those quantum entanglement, what were they called? Quantum entanglement
tubes, I believe.
Tubes, yeah, changes the way that
reconstruction tanks, quantum entanglement reconstruction tanks.
Jesus, wow. Okay. Well, it changes as it did for BioShock, and I've always been mixed about personally. It changes the pacing in the save game basically paradigm, right? Where it's like, well, I can quick save and I can hard save, but I also can just respawn and run back to where I was, and kind of keep going. And that led me to another quick note, and we'll start winding down maybe, but because this has a survival horror element to it, resources end up being a really important part of the game, and resource management, as you mentioned before, using the wrench quite a bit. But because of these tubes in the save game system, there's sort of this natural, essentially spending of the resource currency as you're playing if you don't reload, and so I'm always paranoid as a gamer about that because I'm so OCD, where it's like I needed to embrace it in BioShock, I needed to embrace it in this, that it's okay to just respawn and trust the game that they will replenish my resources through the systems, and but it's really hard for me to do because it's not in my nature.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right to trust this one less. I think they're much less of a problem in BioShock than they are here, because I think that the resources are so precious in this sort of economy that it's going to be tough for you.
See, you just made me paranoid now. So I was like, no, it's going to be fine. I'll embrace it. It's going to be
a game about paranoia, Tim. It's a game of paranoia.
Good. Okay. Yeah. Well, now I'm going to have to just keep reloading. So
yep. Good for you. Okay. All right. With that, I think we'll take a quick pause of this particular audio log, and we'll come back in a minute and kind of wind down the episode.
Nice.
The radiation must have locked the protective seals on engine core access. You're going to have to find some way to purge the radiation from the coolant tubes. Xerxes is blocking me out of the primary data loop, so I can't get any information to help you. He's working for them now.
Welcome back from our break. We thought at the end of each episode we'd like to at least touch on what else we're playing these days. And to that end, Tim, what have you been playing?
Yeah, so I mean, I just recently finished Metal Gear Solid 5 or V, depending on how big of a fan you are. Which we won't talk about too much now. And I'm also playing Witcher 3, which 2 huge games back to back is maybe not the best idea. But most importantly, also recently finished a 10-year battle, 11-year battle with Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth, which was on original Xbox as well as PC. I played it on PC, and man, talk about a game of that era. Well, it was ironically, as you were saying, it's kind of was 2004 or 5, but it feels like a 1998 game sometimes.
Absolutely, it's a game that I think wanted to come out in 2002, and then didn't make it, and then tried for 3, and then tried for 4, and finally made it out in 05.
Which I mean, just like crazy game, like wacky game in so many ways. Like every level, there's some unique mechanic, and they introduce some basically new genre, first-person genre. There's adventure game in there. There's a driving section when you're in the back of a truck with a turret. There's a ship when you're on a big cargo ship, and there's
there's that wild chase scene. There's a fair amount of like talking to inhabitants, or villagers.
The first section of the game, you don't even have a weapon for. It's literally like you're weaponless, just walking around a town, right? And in New England town, and it's Lovecraft, which I'm a huge fan of Lovecraft, so that's why I vowed that I would finish it someday, because I just felt like I had to, and I definitely am happy I did, because as janky as it can be at times, it really is this sort of unpolished gem that I kind of, for people who love that sort of merger of all these crazy genres, especially first-person games, and then there's this horror element to it, and Lovecraft, kind of can't recommend it enough, just because it's so weird.
Yeah, it's definitely an unusual title. I remember finishing it quite a few years back, but it's an experience. I think I actually played it on the original Xbox, if I'm not mistaken. It is a game I anticipated for a long, long time and kept wondering if it was ever going to come out. And then one year it just quietly did. It was from my former employer, ZeniMax, who owns Bethesda Game Studios, and it was published under the Bethesda Softworks brand, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty wild game.
Different developer, though.
Yeah, different developer for sure. I want to say it was developed in Eastern Europe or Russia or something unusual. Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a couple friends that worked on it, and I believe they were in England, but I can't remember. They might have been stateside.
Yeah, it could be. For myself, I've been playing Firewatch, and I mentioned that it's a PlayStation 4 and PC/Mac/Linux title. I mentioned that specifically because it has an opening that reminds me in a way of System Shock 2's, in that it sets up sort of a history for your character. It's also a first-person game, and it's not a combat game, and there's not nearly the sort of level of systems and everything that's going on in System Shock 2. It's I guess vaguely sort of open worldish, more sort of in the Metroid vein, in that you kind of are able to open up more of the world as time goes on, and is not sort of channeling you as linearly through the experience. But it has this opening that uses a sort of Twine-like text adventure, sort of like interface to sort of tell a backstory for your character and let you know him in a very intimate sort of way. It's sort of a different tack altogether from how System Shock 2 works, where you're kind of basically doing, you're filling in the numbers of your character sheet in that opening for System Shock 2. And here it's more of an emotional tone, although you still get to make choices, and it sort of sets the tenor for who your character is going to be, or what you think of this character that you're inhabiting for the rest of the game. So, highly recommended. Made by some friends of mine at Campo Santo Games in San Francisco, and also in Vancouver and London. They're some of them are virtualized. In any case,
I can't wait to play it.
Yeah, very worth playing.
Yeah, especially the Ranger aspect of it all.
Yeah, that fits very well with you, Ranger Rick. Okay, so what are we going to play next time?
Yeah, so up to this first session, we stopped basically right before R&D, and so we're trying to have, obviously the first episode covers kind of a shorter chunk because we talk about, kind of, as we did in this episode, talk about the influences and stuff, so that takes up some time. So the second episode, we're playing a bigger chunk, I don't know, what did you say, about three-ish hours, 3.5 hours?
Yeah, 3 or 4 hours, depending on how quickly you play.
Yeah, so we're going to play up through the next section to hydroponics, basically midway through hydroponics and the biohazard section before you get to the A section of hydroponics. So B and C, section B and C, up through A. So,
yeah, basically what will happen is you'll take an elevator down into the hydroponics deck, and that is split into at least a couple of level loads, and I believe only one of them will be accessible to you, and you'll have to go into that to access the other. So it should be very clear where the dividing line is.
The sort of confusing thing is that you do A after B and C, right? So
yeah, it is strange. You land midships, I guess. I don't know how that's meant to convey itself, but that's how it works. Okay. All right, well, we'll see you all next time. In the meantime, if you'd like to look for us online, you can find us either as ourselves at Brett_Duville or
Tim Longo Jr., that's JR at the end, that's at Tim Longo Jr.,
both at Twitter. Or the podcast can be found at DevGameClub. And you can send us email if you have questions, comments, or whatever at devgameclub@gmail.com. We also have a website coming at devgameclub.com, but still a little bit construction heavy at the moment. So look for us there as time goes on. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm Brett Duville, and he's
Tim Longo. Thanks very much.
See you next time.